fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, I'm here today with Nicolas Villarreal, or Nico, a friend of the show, writer for Palladium Magazine, Cosmonaut Magazine, other things, surely, and a designer of a database system called Casper. Now,
well, I wouldn't be so bold. Basically, it's a website. It's a forum that I created that exists for computational and statistical political economy research.
Basically, from what I understand, you're aiming to do with this. You also work in coordination with LIF, which is this kind of project spearheaded by Sean KB of Antifada fame, which is a workers' inquiry network, right?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to plug more into that. I need to plug back into that because I got thrown off by COVID and wasn't able to participate as much recently. But I definitely love that stuff and have been helping a little bit when I can.
Yeah, similar. I kind of take a consulting thing, and I'm always pointing to people where they might find the stats they're looking for because it's not always easy.
Yeah.
And while a lot of the stats are kind of in the Federal Reserve and kind of in general economic stats and in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, actually often, even when you get the good stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you have to reinterpret their data in different ways because their categories do not match ours.
Yeah.
The information's there, but like, for example, when you look at like jobs in the logistics and sector and you're trying to figure out like who's management or not, you're actually having to go into subcategories of the data. And like, for example, I was trying to figure out like what the average wage was for a factory worker who is non-management, but then I was like, oh yeah, but this also includes just purchasing and all these like quasi-managerial jobs in this data, and I can disaggregate it out, but it takes a lot of time and I have to redo the math myself, and I might need a statistician to help me do it.
It's similar problems with rate of profit stuff because a lot of times, like sometimes I'll see random people on Twitter, usually Marxists, like try to create the rate of profit graphs, and sometimes not Marx. Sometimes people trying to critique Marx, like the Unlearning Economics Twitter account did a while ago, of not really understanding the national accounts categories and what maps onto what, because it's the way the Fed like the website. Well, it's very useful. You could just type into a search, but because the search is the main way that people find things, they'll just look up, oh, like here's corporate profits or whatever, when really what like that excludes lots of things. Like
they'll look at like corporate earnings and they'll look at corporate earnings and compare, for example, things that survive off rents and things that survive off commodity production together. Or they'll do stuff like, I really hate this, and I've seen this for 15 years, using private incomes as markers of profit rates, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's super common, and it's ridiculous. Because actually there's reasons to believe that private incomes would actually go up as there's less profitable investment, because people would hoard their currency even though it's not collecting value because they're afraid of loss. Like, or they'll tie it up, they'll take it in they'll take more and more stuff in private income so they can hide it in like property investment or this, that, and the other, and not into like reinvestment in stocks. And for me, I've always looked at profit rates I've gotten off of. I know GDP is a problematic economic stat, but it actually is pretty good at getting the aggregate profits in the system as understood by capitalists. Like,
right. And the way you actually want to go, like, you want to look at it from like the whole list of national accounts. Like, this is because if you click through, like, oh, where is this stats coming from? It'll show you, like, oh, this goes into this, like the whole, like, basically the balance sheet, or not the balance sheet, the income statement of like the country. And you can see, like, here's the net operating surplus is really what you want to be looking for in terms of like Marxian profit or surplus. And then it breaks it down further, and you can see it line by line. I did one thing that's been rattling around my head recently, just because of like the talking about the transformation debate.
Can you tell people what that is? Because most of my people are up on the difference, but although people get the transformation debate and the calculation debate confused and stuff like that. But yeah,
the transformation, or it's usually called transformation problem, is when, like, Marx in Volume 1 of Capital basically assumes that value and prices are equivalent. But there's a problem with that because the main theory of how, like, prices are, like, that prices in steady state equilibrium, and value is supposed to also be like an equilibrium concept. So they're both equilibrium concepts. But prices in that sense are supposed to be determined by prices of production, of the costs of inputs, and then on top of that is a fixed profit rate, which is important because the idea is when you have two different sectors of the economy that have different profit rates, the whole premise of political economy of like the theory of price is that investment will go into the investment in new businesses will go into the sector with higher profitability, and all that investment and activity will lower profit rates as like more output comes in and stuff like that.
Yeah, so in Marxist econ jargon battles, this is Kleiman, who argues that TSSI solves the problem and makes it consistent, versus econophysics, which argues that it's kind of a problem, but you can statistically get around it.
There's still one other half we have to clarify about this. Is what was said in Volume 1 was that, like, the reason this contradicts what was in Volume 1 was because in Volume 1 it would seem that in the equilibrium, sectors with higher capital intensity would have lower profits because they had less living labor in them.
Right. This is the people who, and you meet these people all the time, who unfortunately I have two guests on my show who believe this, who believe that, for example, the reason why there is a declining rate of profits has to do with capital intensity in machines, which gets debunked pretty easily by people like Steve King. What I find interesting is Capital's Volume 2 and 3 don't imply that at all. Like, so, and in fact, when I started like really thinking about it, I was like, oh no, capital investment would increase competition and thus eventually push profits down, but actually are still immediately rational because they're time-saving devices. It reduces socially necessary labor time so you can exploit labor more. Like, which is a prediction that which was one of the first things that I used in my explorations out of conservative economics in the early aughts for me. This is before the crisis. I realized that Keynesianism had a problem because from Keynesian logic, and Keynes says this explicitly, we should be reducing the work hours. And the reality is that in more capital intensive industries, and as the entire economy becomes more automated, The opposite is true. So, you know,
I mean, you need living labor to have profitability and to have, I mean, and people just like obviously like it, as Marx makes so clear in Volume 1, it is like a basic political issue of income to the different classes, because a shorter it's also like there's a weird Say's law thing going on there too, because the more of like services and stuff that happen, it's also more like real income that capitalists can have, because that's things that they are consuming basically. Like there's like well, first of all, just the most basic thing: the shorter workday, lower capitalist share of income is a ceteris paribus thing that is always true, because the income to workers is fixed. But I bring all this up because the reason, because I've been thinking recently about my experience when I was working as an analyst, for like doing underwriting for housing deals, and like big like developments and stuff like that. And there is a real reality there of a convergence of returns, right? And this is also true in like finance more generally, is that you can like in the sense that like there's no consistent way to beat the market. And especially in real estate, it's more institutionalized there, just because it's like a lot less liquid. That like you're going to expect like 6% or 5% capitalization rate, which is like your returns after accounting for like the cost of buying the place and the financing and all that stuff. And so there is this tendency of equalization of profit rates, which is what this whole debate is about in terms of the transformation debate. Because if there is an equalization of profit rates, then it means that like the problem is there, it's real, and there's this and the volume 1 theory is not quite enough. But the other side of this is, and my opinion is, I intend to delve deeper into it to justify this with more research. But I'm fairly certain, because there is like on a macro level, it is obvious that higher financial investment, higher savings and stuff like that is not equivalent to higher fixed capital investment, right? And the only question is whether that's holds on a sectoral level. Because if it's and I'm fairly certain it is the case that fixed capital investments are determined by technical conditions in firms, like in industries, and the budget of firms, of like their retained earnings. Because like on one sense, it's true that you need higher profit rates to invest back into your industry, because for the most part, companies use their own money to make those investments, like with some financing, but they use their own. They don't like selling stock isn't usually how they do that. They like so like the price of stock, the amount of money going into an industry on a financial level through the stock market, through the bond market, doesn't like it rarely translates into more actual investment on the ground. And maybe like I also still have to figure out, maybe that's just a weird historical quirk of like the neoliberal era.
I was about to say, that seems to be something that I could not prove is neoliberal, but I have a strong suspicion is neoliberal. Because
I'm not sure though.
Okay.
Because go ahead.
No, it's just I would need to look at the end of the 60s to really have a ground of comparison, then maybe look at China now as a ground for comparison. Because like one of the things that gets me really angry at Marxist in particular, look, I expect neoclassical economics to pull shenanigans, because even methodologically, they basically bracket out time, except when they're talking about interest. That's the only time where they're interested in time at all. Whereas Marxists are supposed to be historicists, right? That's what that's part of our methodology. So the difference in time and accumulation in time and accumulated labor really matters. And so some of these changes may be because of like the conditions of capital in general, but I haven't seen studies for the most part that actually do this work for me. The closest thing I actually got to it in a lot of ways, pathetically, is Shrike and Piketty. Shrike on the Marxist side and Piketty on the Keynesian. And Piketty actually does do it historically, talking about, like the rise and decline of growth rates. Although some of his stats are like real projective because he's like giving like growth stats for feudal empires. And I'm like, well, I mean, yeah, I actually tend to agree with you, but I don't know that you can prove it mathematically with comparing anything that it's like comparing apples to metallic kumquats or something. It's not really.
Well, I mean, here's why I think this is so important of the thing with investment, right? Because if it would be really weird if it was a historically contingent thing. It would be absurdly weird because if it's true that investment is not determined by like the financial conditions, by the financial equalization of basically income to capitalists, is a rate of return, then it means that the volume one theory is basically correct. That in terms of prices that consumers face.
And that's what Alexander Kleinman actually argues, by the way, more or less.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't get that sense.
Well, I mean, there's some shenanigans with the TSSI. So, and I've gone through that book and even played with its math, and I don't know that I actually understand it. Because all of its math is hypothetical. There are no actual examples. All of it is logical examples, and that's a methodological thing for Kleinman. Like he's trying to prove in an ideal world this is ideally consistent. And so there's no, because part of the transformation problem is also an accusation that Marx is inconsistent, period. And that's one of the things that they want to argue.
That's such like a Marxological thing. I don't care.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the entire argument. Claiming Marxism is a Marxological claim so that Kleinman can tell the Schafferans and the Sweezyites to suck it.
Like, but I mean, you can reverse that at any author and say they're inconsistent because that's literally how, like, no one author over such like a large body of work is going to have consistency. It's not possible.
No, I am with you on this. Even in the course of Capital, I'd be highly surprised. Like, I have spoken my falling out with the Emancipation Network had to do with personal shit, but also a debate about whether or not Henrik Grossman was hyper revisionist because Marx never believed in the immiseration thesis. And I was like, no, he sure as fuck did before 1855. He says it in letters. Yeah. And then the argument I got back, which was recycled from Andrew Kleinman, whose name I should not mention because the man personally hates me, was that the plain reading of the text was not correct. Right.
What is he saying that is like what I'm saying here? What was the...
No, Kleinman was basically arguing that there is no problem in Capital Volume 1. Mm-hmm. That if you factor in time, if you treat it as a single system, but you factor in time, the contradiction goes away. The question is like, there's all kinds of weirdnesses in that, though, because, for example, Kleinman doesn't want to deal with how this is expressed, so he doesn't argue that it needs to be commodity money. He argues that like non-commodity money is still consistent with this, but I was like, well, how do you measure anything when you're not measuring it? Like when you're saying that currency has no stable value, like in relation to price anyway. And then he also says that it's not predictive of individual price, that it's only predictive of aggregate price, which is similar to what econophysicists say, but he hates the econophysicist. So I don't really know. I feel like there's a logical stake in this that I don't understand.
Here's my problem with that, though, is because I'm pretty sure that maybe he addresses this somewhere. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that like that factoring in time of a before and after in terms of value is not compatible with Volume 1, because when you look at the sections about how technological change impact value, it's the idea that if the technical conditions in the industry is changing, like the value is changing with it at the same time. There is no before and after. It is simultaneous.
Well, no, he doesn't think it's simultaneous.
No, that's the problem. Is that's a contradiction with Volume 1.
Oh, right. So the reason why I'm just gonna key up the factions before we get into this. We're not gonna go over all of them because, man, this by itself.
Mm-hmm.
I actually want to eventually get a scholar who's just mapped out all the problems and answers to the transformation problem, because one of the things Climate claims is like his answer is the most parsimonious while also having the heuristic of charity, meaning that you should believe it because it's logically consistent and that's most likely to be true. And I've argued that logical consistency is not a truth clarification, that it's a truth disqualification, but something can be logical and a good reading but not true.
Yeah.
But anyway, the factions that I do know of, you have the Hamrickians, who basically want to throw the entire question out, just not important. And you argue with them on Twitter all the time. I see you all the time. There are the econophysicists who think that the problem is real, but it is solved by probability, which Marx didn't really have that much access to. Because what you actually have is Marx encountering a problem that the math wasn't fully developed for. I mean, probability's old, but you know what I mean? Like, the math wasn't fully developed for him to process, which is close to my position. Like, I think what you see in Capital is basically trying to use accounting math to do things accounting math can't do. You have the Marxist humanist TSSI thesis, and then you have the SSI thesis, and then you have the Shafferans, and then you have whatever Shrike is, which I can't figure out, and then you have Fred Mosley. All right. That's like 8 factions to this one problem. Now, for most Marxists, when you mention the transformation problem or when you mention the various theories of value, eyes glaze over. But what I've found super frustrating is, because of a lack of understanding of the significance of this problem and because of inconsistent use of data, like we were talking about before, people kind of cherry picking the data sets they're using.
I will give Mosley credit. He's the best on that, because in his book on the post-war rate of profit, he includes every methodology that was popular at the time and compared them. And like they all kind of converged because the same underlying national accounts data is the same. But he was pretty good with the stats on that.
So my reading is kind of as follows. That Mosley is the best person as far as contextualizing what Marx was actually doing, and that Heinrich is the best philologer, meaning the person who actually reads all the text and tells you how they all line up or don't line up, but give with everything else. But that I think Heinrich comes up with some theories to make problems not problems that aren't justified in the text. Like, and unfortunately, he's not beloved in America because of his MAGA 2 work. He's beloved in America because of the theories that we're talking about now. And most Marxists, this debate's been going on for so long. I mean, that's what people also don't know. This debate's been going on for 100 years. Going away all the way to Bob Bowen.
What you were talking about earlier, or what we were talking about with like, is it historically contingent that like investment is now detached from financial investment. If that's the case, you've unlocked a secret new theory that the Volume 1 labor theory of value has only been true since the 70s.
Oh my God, you're right. That would strongly imply that, yeah, it's true, but kind of. like Marx was somehow accidentally right for the future. Oh wow. I mean, which would also imply that only neoliberalism hits the conditions of true capitalism, which makes no sense actually, because neoliberalism is not actually free market capitalism, despite the way people use the term.
I'm going to assume that it's not historically contingent on, or as it's not that historically contingent, because that feels more right. But if I find evidence to the contrary, I'll let you know.
Well, for me, this is a problem of the number of things I have to know to actually win this argument is beyond my pay grade. And this is one of the few times where I'll admit that, where I'm like, okay, so I need to figure out ideal conditions and then actual historical conditions and then compare the two, which involves fairly complicated math. And we don't even agree on what the terms mean and whether or not I can use conditions as stated in volumes 2 and 3, or am I limiting myself to volume 1 to prove that volume 1 by itself is consistent with volumes 2 and 3 or are as contradictory with them.
So this is actually
why is this important? However, like, why is this not just a Marx nerd point?
Well, here's the thing: is that it's a problem, not just it's a problem that it exists. It's a problem that we're talking about it. It's a problem that like it's so complicated. We need we need to there needs to be somebody who attacks this and resolves it and stuff. But I also think that there's a lot of work that we can be doing that is not related to this. That is building like a new research project that is still somewhat on the same lines, but is like what I've been writing about recently, what I've been trying to articulate. It's not published yet, several things. But we need people in general, like the masses, proletariat, workers, everyone, to just have some grasp of political economy and some ideas of how to do things, to know about the material world and how it's getting reproduced. Because right now, as it exists, like for the large part, the people who run the economy, like the economic bureaucracy of like the Fed, the NBER, Bank of England, so on, like these people are like they're not they might be have their own weird neoclassical models they're obsessed with that are very stupid, but they are not smarter than the rest of us as a general rule, and are prone to their own kind of motivated.
They're definitely not
reasoning.
smarter than us collectively. Like that. I always talk about this because people think I'm a super big downer and think that everyone's stupid, and I actually don't. Because I talk about collective intelligence. I'm like, just statistically speaking, if I take an aggregate answer of people who don't have, if they don't have motive, like cultural or identitarian reasons to have motivated reasoning, am I to take the aggregate answer of what people have, particularly if they have just a little bit of skin in the game? And weirdly, this is a whole prediction markets thing, but it's actually not a bad theory. Collective intelligence is better than individual intelligence on aggregate. They may not be, particularly if it doesn't require specialized knowledge, but even if it does, like, now there are checks to that. Like whenever there's a cultural reason for people to be motivated, if there's high cultural biases involved, then yes, collective intelligence goes to shit, and it's actually like the individual is more likely to be right. But that's only on issues where you have large scale, highly motivated reasoning. And so the more people who can participate and have access to these economics, the more you can do with them. I had someone on, this will be coming out probably a month, but I had someone on who became an ecological journalist and realized he had to learn currency and currency flows. And he was first into MMT and sort of went beyond that just by looking at objective conditions on the ground. And like, yes, he's an educated person. He's got a college degree, but not a college degree in economics. And he's just basically posited something like a Marxist position from post Keynesianism by just reading policy papers and financial journalism over the course of 3 years. You can do it on your own, like particularly if you're not already attached to the theory, which arguably you and I are. But I'm pretty open as to how I think, for example, whether or not I think MMT conditions truly contradict Marx or not is a big one, because I have been reading, yes, Capital Volume 1 assumes commodity money. Capital Volume 2 talks a lot about credit money. Doesn't really talk about other forms of government money. And yes, Marx did assume some things from early history that were wrong because he picked them up from Adam Smith. But in general, I'm open to whether or not there is a direct, whether or not, for example, something that seems like power theory of value is partially correct. Now, I'm not a power theory of value person. There's reasons why. But
I mean, my big problem with them is methodologically, they're political scientists and they're using like political science indexes basically as their gauge of power.
Right. That's the funny thing, right? Because they say, well, that's the funny thing about them. I was just reading that book, is they critique Marxism for, talking about how labor value is only an abstraction, doesn't exist. And marginal utility and utilitarian utils are an abstraction that really don't exist, and they really don't exist. But then I'm like, but you're using power indexes. How is that more actually measurable? Like, and what is that a proxy for? Like, you're still using an abstraction.
And I think it's even worse because it does have the same. I feel that it has the same issues of which is a valid critique of like Cockshott's like regressions of like as it relates to size and stuff. But I don't think it's as valid as people think it is. But it's like, this is like, you're basically assuming this correlation and enforcing it through like this methodology. Like it's, you kind of start with it and end with it. Certainly I think that like if you were to do like independent measures of power, you would probably still find something, but it doesn't matter. I think it's mildly interesting. I don't think it's as explanatory as they think it is. I think that they highly underestimate what the labor theory of value still has going for it.
That's my thing, because I'm like productive capacity comes from labor ultimately.
Yeah,
you can't argue labor plus machines if you want, but I think machines do something else. And so I've actually, because of that, I've actually not been as skeptical of like some of the claims of modern monetary theorists, while still thinking that I pretty much hold to labor theory of value, because the productive forces are what determines what an economy can do under most of those theories. And so I just go, well, why don't you cut to the chase? Right? Like, yeah, there is a real sense in which the productive forces to produce, bombs and guns do skew the equation. Absolutely. Yeah. But it's still productive forces that produce those bombs and guns. So, anyway, I think there's a lot of people who just want to throw out labor theory of value altogether. And it's weird also because I've noticed that Marxists are bad at defending it. Like, even though we live in a time period where it's no longer taboo to believe, because remember in the 80s and 90s, most Marxists said they didn't believe in labor theory of value. You still see that in Zizek and David Harvey because they're of that generation.
Yeah.
But even the ones that do, don't defend it very well. They don't know how to for whatever reason.
Yeah. And for that, I think the I think Cockshot actually deserves some credit there, as far as and the kind of physics people in general did a lot to have some good data and stuff on that.
Yeah,
I think
you know that I have a, and I know you do too for his actual like cultural politics, but I have a pretty strong distaste in my now for Cockshot. But I do actually think, say, like Emmanuel Fajun and whatnot.
Oh yeah,
that
Parts
those
of
people
Mackover.
Mackover are really useful. Like
Ian
go
Wright,
back and read
too.
Laws of Ian Wright is pretty good. I'm slightly biased against Ian Wright. But I think it's because of the Climanite bias of the community I used to be a part of, not because of Ian Wright's actual arguments. Because I think Ian thinks I'm a Climanite, which I think is funny, like really, really funny. But it's weird because I think even amongst Marxists you and I like, there's a hostility that, for example, there's a reason why everyone fucking talks about Lenin and not Marx. Because to talk about Marx, you actually have to talk about economics, and you have to get into stuff that's a lot less sexy than like party building.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been trying to push back on, because I think that from the 70s to the 90s, you had a basically Bernsteinian economism that even affected anarchists. Totally true. The assumption that like productive forces would either break down in our favor and we wouldn't have to do anything, or would produce enough in our favor and we wouldn't have to do anything, was a general assumption on different parts of the left. Okay, fair, true. In the aught teens going up to Trump, there seemed to be a response in the other direction that became hyper political deterministic.
Yeah.
Not just in Keynesian economics where that's clearly the case, but also in Marxist economics.
Yeah.
And I kind of think you have to be somewhere in between those spheres. I don't know, maybe I'm a dialectician or something, but like that.
I think Grossman's politics were actually pretty good on that, of all
right.
people.
He doesn't actually think that the collapse of capital is going to lead to a revolution, which is it's a misreading of what he was saying.
Yeah. It's very similar to like Lenin's like preparedness of and getting people ready to think, because, and this is also like why I think it's so important that people learn. Well, there's two things here, right? That people have to understand like what's going on in the material world on a fundamental level, or else they're going to be like there's so many folk right-wing kind of ideas about the economy that are just infected in so many people's minds about like currency debasement and
currency debasement, secret cabal bankers run the world.
Yes.
And when I say stuff like the Federal Reserve kind of runs the world because it's true, they think I'm saying a secret cabal bankers run the world, which is not what I'm saying at all.
No.
But it sounds similar. And if you're observing things with partial knowledge and no real theory, it looks like a secret cabal of bankers is running the world and arbitrarily clashing the entire economy sporadically because reasons. Like,
yeah, but there's another important reason here that's, I think, and all of this comes out like the reason. I mean, Marx did what he did, like he wrote Capital for workers, but you got to remember that, like at the same time, like how different the way of knowing about the economy was in the 1800s compared to everything since. Because after 1900, academic economics starts to exist.
Right.
It really starts in the 1880s, but it started to become integrated into the state early 19th century.
Yeah,
You
mean early 20th century?
Yeah, early
20th century.
Yeah. And they like it no longer like in the 1800s there were societies, not even like radical Marxist societies or whatever, of like this was most people knew about, even the biggest experts knew about political economy just by participating in these societies of like inquiries and like research and stuff like that. And there were ordinary professionals and workers involved, and then they did the reading themselves. There were barely any classes. It was so different this was the environment that Marx was writing for, basically, and it no longer exists. People really don't think they can know about like economics, and this is important for a second reason, because the knowledge to plan things in a non-bourgeois, non-capitalist way does not exist on a practical level today.
Right.
And there's always this common thing. It's like, oh, the workers, they know how to do things. Once they take control, then they'll do it according to how they want.
No, they won't.
Actual coordinating mechanisms do not yet exist. The way of like the people knowing about how to do that does not exist. You have to create that. You have to have people sit down and write it out, you know?
But this is like my whole thing when I talk about skills sharing and all that is I'm like, partly because we've lost these skills because they've been knowledge captured in academia and in elite financial institutions, and partly because the complexity level is actually way above anything that existed in the 18th and 19th century, and the 20th century and, oh my God, 21st century levels of economic complication baffle everyone. I mean, like, I think anyone kind of gets that, like, oh, the Federal Reserve has no idea what the fuck to do, like, because what the knock-on effects of trying to set economic policy for the entire planet by focusing on one currency's, strength or weakness is impossible for any one person to predict. So we have to build these skills, we have to build these mechanisms, and that is historically part of the purpose of a party, of workers' organizations, etc. But you also have to deal with the fact that workers' organizations have developed their own bureaucracies and their own concessions, and they have strategic things they don't want to look at either.
Yeah. No, I think this can't just be a party thing. This has to be a thing that people just do in general. That they learn this for themselves, and there are independent societies of these things going on in the world, and it's why I created that website. Why I created the Casper forum, because I wanted these discussions to happen and this knowledge to build up. And we've had some great discussions of different accounting schemes, different planning mechanisms, and like even like, oh, what's the best way to run linear regressions to do all these planning calculations or whatever. Like that, those are important questions that of knowledge that should be out there.
Yeah, I think it's vitally important that we have to, and that means that we can't rely on these statistics, and we can't rely on people trying to use them to win Twitter debates or academic debates.
Well, I think the statistics are still useful. I think that you have to have like a note of like with a grain of salt,
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm saying as a person who says the people who want to totally throw out GDP and says, well, since it's a suboptimal measure, we should just not look at it ever. I think that's ridiculous, actually. Yeah. But what I am saying also, we can't settle these debates. Like, fuck, we have a hard time settling out class composition debates with normal statistics because nobody defines these things in the same way. Sometimes even the same people don't define them in the same study the same way. Like the vector that they're using. I mean, even for example, the DSA did that when they had that kind of informal YouGov poll, and they used education level as a proxy for whether or not you were a worker. Which I'm like, okay.
There's a whole psychoanalytic thing you could say about that. I will not. I really think that part of it is that people need to understand statistics. They need to understand. They should also learn coding, I think, and learn how to run models like that. It's very useful.
I can run models, but not coding, so I'm halfway there.
It's really not hard. If you're always looking stuff up on what this function does or whatever, but it's not that hard. If I was able to do it.
Well, here's one thing I will say. Sometimes I think our numeracy is deliberate. To sound conspiratorial, but I'm like, you and I talked about this. Neither one of us were good at math in high school. I realized I was good at math in a graduate level statistics class that I had to take after getting my ass kicked in calculus, and then retook it later and still got my ass kicked, but kind of understood it the second time. And even objectively speaking, like 10 years later when I took the GRE, even after I took those classes, I took GRE again in my 30s because I thought I was going to get my PhD. My math skills had increased on my own. All right. Yeah. Whereas I felt hampered by math in high school, and we've completely changed the way math is taught, and it's not any better.
Yeah.
So, it's, I don't know. I get real. That's the only time I sound conspiratorial about education is I feel like, well, it's a whole generation of people who think math is some kind of magic skill that most people just don't have, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I think the big problem is we just don't operationalize it in high school. Like this, whatever problems they have, like you get the right answer, you don't. Like it's never towards anything useful in the way like physics calculations are, or like statistics to learn about something, or if you're coding something, it's not the same.
Right. The moment you see math becomes useful, which is redundant as fuck, but still definitely the case.
It's like teaching people how to read without giving them books,
Which we're doing, by the way, as a side note. That's something we also do as a society now.
Which is also why it took me until second grade to really actually read, because that's how long it took me to get my hands on a chapter book. Everything else I just hated so much. My parents would tell me that I have vague recollections of. It's like you need that like thing that's actually interesting to people, not just like rote learning or whatever.
Yeah, and if anything, we moved more into the latter in the last 10 years, but it shows up in literacy. That's a whole different podcast, though. But really, I mean this, and like when I say this stuff, and I know no one in the DSA likes this kind of stuff. No one in the CPUSA likes this kind of stuff. The CPUSA is better than the DSA is on it. But when I'm like, look, the reason why you guys patronize workers is that you don't want to do the work to educate them where they are. And yes, they also probably don't want to do the work to be educated where they are because they don't see the purpose in it in their daily life. And if they don't see the purpose in it, I too would rather fucking play video games.
Yeah.
So how do you get people to understand their own skin in the game? And that for them to believe after a crushing education system that they also have the capacity to do it. All right. Mm-hmm. That's something we should be doing.
Yeah.
And when you started the Casper forum, I was like, yeah, you're proving we can do our own sociology. We can do it ourselves. Like, this is not that hard. Even if we don't all have the math skills, plenty of us will develop them or already have them, even if they're not formally educated. I mean, I'm sorry, you actually kind of can't be a carpenter or many other of the blue collar crafts without having some grasp on fucking math. Yeah. Like, whether you realize it or not. Like, yeah, it's but this is also where I go on the rant about how like people relaxing educational standards for poor people actually fucking them hard.
Yeah.
Like this is a me versus the liberals where I sound like an educational conservative. Because I'm like, no, you should absolutely be draconian in the way you teach. I actually don't necessarily even believe in grades. So like draconian teaching should be decoupled from grading. But executive function declining infotainment is not good for you.
I mean, it's so like reading those articles about those Jewish schools in New York really clarifies the issue of what you do when you don't educate people properly is you create dependence.
Yep.
And more dependence means better social control.
But you know, a lot of liberals believe that more dependence is good. I mean, like they would say we sound conservative right now.
But screw them.
Yeah, but you know I'm right. You know I'm right. You know how many people think that the purpose of like gay luxury fully automated space communism, which by the way is impossible. Like the way it is sold to people.
Mm-hmm.
It's like where there are no workers at all.
Yeah.
It's impossible. Like, and if you had the robotics to do that, those robots are people.
Yeah. Yeah, this is exactly what, like, there's these amazing sections of classical economy, and I was actually talking to Ian Wright about this the other day, is that we are actually, like, the advances that we've had are quite incredible. I still think there are several important developments we haven't made to really making, well, what in the book that they called it a universal machine, which is used to describe what humans are, is that we have this dexterity, we have this general intelligence. It allows us to do pretty much any task imaginable.
We are capable of real fuzzy logic that is actually super useful.
Yes.
Like,
and we are close enough that you can imagine such like a robot with similar levels of intelligence and dexterity and an ability to manipulate the world being created. And if that exists, one, labor theory of value stops being true. Two, like those are effectively like people.
Or it's true because those are robot people and we shouldn't be oppressing them. Like,
well, I mean, it no longer becomes true because the inputs to create labor are no longer like human inputs.
Fair, okay.
Mm-hmm. But I have this wonderful science fiction story world idea. I wrote a short story in it. It's like a socialist society in the Shenandoah Valley, where like everybody gets, when they're kids, they're assigned like this little robot friend that grows with them and is like their own person. And sometimes they drift apart and sometimes they don't. And like these are members of society essentially. And Reza Negrestani actually makes an interesting point that in order for general intelligence to even exist, it needs like a social aspect to it.
Yes, agreed.
Of like interacting, like, which begs the question of whether even like a like paperclip maximizer destroying the world is really possible, or if that's like one, or if it's even intelligence too.
I would say like it's maybe possible, but it's not intelligence. That's my general reading of that. But
I'm not sure it's really possible. There might be something about like actually how information like gets like works, and like
I'm open to that, but I'm open to that with the caveat is I have no fucking clue.
Yeah, let's hope we don't find out.
Yeah, like
I don't want to. I don't want to be turned into paper clips.
Right, but I would argue that it is pretty easy to say that is not intelligent. I don't think. Like I can see how a dormant virus can destroy the world too, but it's also not really intelligent. So,
I love thinking about that kind of stuff. I would love to live in a world where suddenly there's so many new avenues opened up by that. I feel that like AI technology is also incredibly destructive, and it's also, you know what, it's also something that we should be teaching ourselves. Like there are certainly like people are now getting their their grubby hands on like the new art models to make porn or whatever. But like people, like hobbyist communities need to exist outside of that to teach people about this and develop it towards their own purposes. And at the same time, like it's very dangerous, and like something like we have to create a whole new social immune system for what's about to come. Like imagine, like there was this, like this is so off topic of what we were originally talking about, but like imagine like the text or the language transformers being used by like militaries to create psyops basically online, and you can't tell the difference between like their text and human text. And eventually I got to imagine that states are just going to shut that, like those kinds of social media down, and now everything's like, oh, you need like a state ID or something to post on social media. Like there's hope, there's going to be so many social adjustments about to happen because of this.
There are already states where like social media limitations are quite heavy because of that, and I am also not optimistic. Actually, what I'm not optimistic about also is that these social media platforms are going to be viable for a lot longer, which is a whole different discussion, because part of that has to do with social infrastructure, but part of that has to do with literal physical infrastructure that people aren't thinking about.
I mean, I created like my own website with its own servers in the hope to like kind of get out of like the corporate sphere. There's no ads or anything. I did it exactly the way I wanted it to, which was nice. But at the same time, that server is a part of like a building that has a bunch of other servers in it.
Right.
And if that building burns down, maybe there's a backup somewhere. There's probably some redundancy. But
there's not a lot of it though. I mean, like we've had problems here in Utah with server farms being so big that like we can't service the cooling of them.
Yeah.
Like,
and that's going to be a bigger problem with climate change and and cooling in general. It's something like as soon as I saw those headlines about the nuclear power plants, their output is going down because the rivers are not big enough.
Right. There are apparently 3.5 generation nuclear power plants. I talked about it today that may be able to handle that problem. But the old ones can't. And so and yet also most of the other green technologies have basically been, well, we're going to throw these green technologies. They're not very efficient, do not have a lot of energy input per output. And we're just going to like supplement that by buying oil from a place that can carbon pollute that we're not looking at, our natural gas. In the case of Europe.
Such like, this is like basic thermodynamics, that you need a temperature differential in order to make stuff work. And
like we were talking, I was talking about something that I only barely have thought about before. But like, so for example, if most buildings in the 20th century are built to codes that do not regulate for temperature. So for example, in the South, I was talking about you go to Southern houses that were built before the 1950s, and they are built for the environment. Kitchen is off. You have giant porches. You have huge windows. You have high ceilings. You're in the upper west. You have low ceilings, small windows, big portico windows that don't have like, okay, some of that still exists in the architecture by habit, but the houses now are not built for that. So how do you compensate for that? You compensate for that, and you have to compensate for it with climate modification, aka air conditioning and heating. And the heating we understand, but we also understand the cost of air conditioning. But when people are like, "Oh, well, what are you going to do?" I'm like, "Well, you're going to have the entire population leave the Southeast because that's what you built." But then, if it gets hot enough in New York City and you put wall units in everywhere, it makes the city hotter. It actually creates a feedback loop because the scale of the heat pump out, which pumps it into the city, raises the temperature of the city.
Yeah. Actually, when you talk about the Southeast, it reminded me of that King of the Hill line that like this, the city is like a testament to man's hubris or something, about talking about Phoenix.
Right. Which is the future.
Yeah. But it's not just a problem of like fitting it to a particular climate though, because now like think about the winter storm in Texas and that kind of stuff.
We have no idea how to like like I've been telling people for more than a decade that it just like climate change means more extreme weather. It doesn't just mean hotter weather, although it is it is net aggregate even hotter than we predicted. I mean, in Utah, for example, it's led to very mild weather and more rain, but we survive off of snowpack for our water, and the rain doesn't, even though we're getting a lot more rain, it doesn't compensate for that. Because the ground can't, because it's been fucking desert for so long, can't really absorb all that water. It just runs off. So it would take probably a century or two of this weather pattern for the ground to really adjust. And by that time, we're going to have arsenic clouds.
Yeah.
So it's yes, people need to understand this. And one thing I've been trying to get people to understand is a lot of Marxists, because they're into this American declinist narrative, have not been looking at world economic trends realistically, because I've been for years saying Europe is not in a good spot. You guys keep on thinking it's going to
be so much worse almost everywhere else.
Yeah. It's like, and people are like, China's going to save us. I'm like, China just hit a wall. It's not a hard wall. China is the economy most posited to deal with that wall, but it's hit a wall, and it's got a demographic bomb just like we do. And there's a way to get around that demographic bomb, but no one politically wants to do it, which is a lot of immigration.
Or as I've liked to point out, decreasing the workday significantly.
Yeah, but again,
they're not going to do that.
They're not going to do that. So it's, and I mean, you've seen this in like, I've noticed that China stands have all shut the fuck up in the last 4 months. Like, and I say this as a person who is very worried about how antagonistic the United States is being with China.
Yeah.
For stupid shit.
I mean, we're being so stupid in so many ways. I don't, like, maybe the government, like with Ukraine that's going on right now, that we're basically telling these people that we're going to go to conventional war with Russia if they use a nuke, which is basically saying that Ukraine is under our nuclear umbrella by like a step removed, and which is insane. That's insane. Because
the moment they nuke like NATO troops, we're going to be in a nuclear. We will be throwing a nuke at them. Like,
it's so like, are we stupid? Are we as a society stupid?
Here's what I have to say though. I want to point out. I also think we've been giving Russia, those of us on the left have been giving Russia too much, those of us who are not Ukraine apologists, right? And by Ukraine apologists, I mean NATO apologists, like, because I have no problem with Ukraine defending itself. They technically did not start this. They are being used in a pawn in a geopolitical proxy war, clearly. And it's also pretty clear to me, for example, that the United States initially wanted to turn it into a quagmire on the border of Europe, and that the Ukrainians fought better than even we predicted, and now we're having to deal with the backlash of that.
The U.S. holds all the power in this. We can say negotiate, or else we're cutting you off, and that's it. And there's no, like, there is no even attempt to do that. And I'm worried it's because we buy our own liberal bullshit of like, Ukraine can do what they want. We're just gonna stand by them or whatever.
I don't think so. I think really? It's much more cynical than that. No, I think.
Okay, I hope you're right.
But I also think you do have to lay the blame of Vladimir Putin over a relatively small dispute in the grand scheme of things, fundamentally changing the nuclear calculus from the Soviet period. He's doing something that Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev and even Andropov would not do.
Yeah, it's suicidal. I mean, it's
like, so I've just been like, it's like I'm watching two drunken people fight, and China just being like, well, you just cut off all of what we were planning to do, and we're the only responsible party in the room.
Yeah.
And like I said, this, I'm a China realist. Like if you start talking to me about how they're socialist, I'm going to roll my eyes at you. But I do think they have been historically and recently the most responsible bourgeois power, particularly under Xi actually. And they've done a lot to mitigate things, because I do believe there are elements of that government that really truly do believe they're going to eventually transition to socialism, and they're in it for the long haul, right? So I can take a defensive stance on that and not buy every pro-China argument that's ever made. But I have to tell you that the Russia-Ukraine thing has totally changed their calculus. And with the inflation stuff and the Fed throwing at it too, they're retreating, and then they have to maintain zero COVID, because if they don't maintain zero COVID, let's be honest, and they start losing large parts of the aging population, they just accelerated their demographic crisis, and the entire world's economic system falls apart before it can even build the infrastructure to decouple.
I mean, part of this is still like, I think that they are very foolish for not being more aggressive on better vaccines. I think they have like
they made mistakes. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, like they were too bullish on like Sinovac as like a national pride thing, I think. But
yeah, no party in the major powers, including in not taking COVID seriously in the beginning. Like we have to include that.
Yeah, I mean, so many other countries have much lower deaths than we did.
Yeah, but I mean, even I also mean China too. Like we both know, like, but we have totally, like, all the major powers have totally blown the pooch. But you know who's gonna, like, Europe is a major power whose exposure has become the most obvious. Yeah, like they can't heat, they're gonna run out of food. Britain has, by a mixture of this happening, another European financial crisis, and Brexit, has showed that while we always talk about the US deindustrializing, Britain really did, and then it pulled out of the European industrial governance and now has nothing. Like, it's not useful for money laundering anymore. So, I mean, yeah.
I mean, it's pretty funny that the end result of all this is probably going to be that France will be the master of Europe once again.
Yeah. France manages to outflank Germany, because Germany tried to use the EU as the kind, gentle Fourth Reich of neoliberal governments, and France had better energy policy, so it's going to do better. Although I also think the center won't hold in France for a whole lot longer. Like France.
No, Macron has he's done the classic African dictator thing, but on like a liberal bourgeois level of like burning like the chance of a coup, like trading off the chance of a coup for a civil war, and the liberal, like, modern developed version of this is burning off the chance of like any particular person offing him, while increasing like all the major tensions in society and the like extremism of the political like environment.
Yep, you basically have you have sacrificed the center to maintain your power with an unfunctional government, basically, that is only surviving in relative to the rest of the EU because France is so powerful. I mean, we see the pigs are having the same problem that we've seen everywhere, and that I've been worried about in the United States. However, I think people underestimate that the United States is a very conservative country. Our right isn't conservative anymore. It's reactionary. So people are now settling into an anti-leftist, even anti-liberal in the US sense, Democratic Party. That they're like, well, you've experimented by giving the progressives some bones. Don't ever do that again. And that's a sentiment that polls rail right now, even amongst young people. I'm doing it will have come out by the time this airs, but I'm doing a whole breakdown of that, like what the polls say. And I'm like, well, basically we see all these weird ideologies because the left is running out of steam and no one wants to be associated with liberalism or progressivism, and the left is associated with both. So as people flay onto the center, the people who are attracted to any counter-systemic force are going to follow weird shit.
MAGA communism.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And those things are gonna get conservative money because it removes parts of the liberal coalition. But the liberal coalition is actually growing, but it doesn't. When I say liberal here, I just mean Democrats. But it's increasingly going to be conservative identified.
Here's the thing: is that liberals are panicking about democracy right now, and don't understand that the whole thing with like, oh, the Republicans are going to use like the state legislatures or whatever. They're not going to need to. They're not going to need to do anything about the two-party system, about like elections or anything.
You actually kind of get the feeling that at least Mitch McConnell in the center of the GOP is setting the GOP up to fail so they can get rid of some of this stuff in the next election cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, like, I kind of feel like they're like throwing money to some of the candidates they've thrown money to indicates to me they knew that they were willing to do that with the Democrats. And I also think what we're just going to have is the Republican Party is going to increasingly be divided and the Democratic Party is not, which is going to look a lot like what's happening in Canada, where I think Trudeau could shoot someone and is incredibly unpopular, but it's going to be really hard to unseat him.
I mean, part of the problem is that, like, with me trying to envision like a decade of democratic success or whatever, is there's no figure that seems ready to like take on after Biden.
But do you see a figure that's ready to take on after Trump?
No, but Trump has a few more years in him.
Yeah, but I think that's an easy answer. He has more power, not in power, than in power. He does not want to risk losing, and right now he would. Yeah. I think, I think one of the things that Marxists don't do very well is they rely off their gut, which either tells them to be wildly overestimate what they're able to do or wildly underestimate what they're able to do. They're also the people who thought we were going to lose in 2020. I say we. I don't really think of myself as a Democrat at all. I did not really want Biden to win. But I didn't want Trump to win either. I didn't vote for either one of them. So it's a problem right now because we literally cannot imagine the center holding, and yet the center has held for 20 years.
Yeah.
Even under Trump, it held, which indicates how strong it actually is.
And the reason for all this is, and the reason why Trump is not going to become like a dictator or whatever is very simple.
He's not going to live long enough, even if he gets elected.
Well,
but yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's a simple fact that the proletariat as a political entity does not exist in the United States.
Correct.
And because of that, there is no need for the fact that like the social...
There is no mass politics because there's no need for mass politics. Right?
The social control of the bipartisan, like two-party system, the federal government is immense, and it's not going away. There's not going to be civil war. There's not going to be all these other.
The Civil War drunk is fantastic, and I can't believe the people who pushed it on the liberal side, who pushed it to the conservatives, started believing it themselves, believed it. Because when you actually pin them down, they weren't defining civil war like a civil war. They were basically defining it as random stochastic terrorism on a larger scale. And I'm like, well, we've seen that before, and you didn't call that a civil war.
Yeah.
Like, I don't just mean in Italy, but people forgot how violent the 1990s were. I don't know. That's not even that long ago. I and you were both alive. So I think you were alive.
Briefly. 1997.
Oh God, I'm older than you. That's my junior year of high school. All right. I just don't age. I'm some kind of weird Marxist vampire.
Yeah.
So I tell people I stay young off of spite. But
my grandma, she lived to be 100. She drank Coca-Cola every day. That was what kept her young, with the full sugar. No, I don't do the full sugar. We live in a diabetic age. Yeah. No, I'm so this is why I've supported your project. This is why I'm interested in the Casper Forum, is because when we map out conventional politics right now,
even including Bernie, even including Squad, I don't see a way forward.
Yeah.
And so the way to have a way forward now is to understand the lay of the land for us to build it. And we don't understand the lay of the land. Like I like, you know, I know that you're a fan of the neo-Kauts, and you know, aka the soft Leninist. They're I called them squishy trots in the past, but they get mad at me when I do that.
And soft Leninist doesn't even sound like an insult almost. That sounds pretty good.
Well, I don't mean it as an insult. I think it's because to me there's two schools of neo-Kautskyism. There's also that Eric Blank school that has used the McNair's neo-Kautskyism, but like brackets out all the stuff about forming social formations with the right of the Social Democrats. They just ignore all that. And I think there's the kind of slightly more leftward ones who I politically am probably way closer to, but they're very interested in party building right now, and they think they can build a party off of the political will. And that last part, I don't believe. Like, I don't see any evidence for that under current conditions, because when they did that last time, even though politicalization, the parties came, actually, it's true, at a nadir of class, class agitation, totally true. There was still 100 years of illegal but thorough class agitation as capitalism was forming that has been largely suppressed even in Europe and folded into the former working apparatus of capital. That's a different condition set. Yeah. You can't just wish a party out of that. Like, and I know, like, when you listen to Adolf Reed, who goes back and forth on whether or not he meant this, but he'd say stuff like, well, we're running Bernie to build the labor movement. And I'm like, but you need the labor movement so you can have Bernie. What are you doing? You're in a circular cul-de-sac forever.
Yeah, I was optimistic that there was something like that possible at one point. We're far beyond that now. Like, that project is done. We need to start thinking about other things.
But like you are I would say you are not quite as pessimistic as I was, but you are pretty close to my position now. Yeah. And to me, I don't care. I'll take allies when I get them. You don't have to, this is the one thing. I am a sectarian of one. All right. But I am not so sectarian that I won't work with other groups, even other groups that I won't join. I've always had I don't really love the DSA, but I'll work with DSAers because they are a major game in town. I'm not going to give them money. I might give their drives money for specific things if they're not attached to a candidate. But that's always been my operational principle, because I kind of right now, my organizational loyalties are to unions, and my union's a mess. But, that's my union. And until there's a better option, and people always tell me the ADF is a better option, but then I look at the ADF, and at the national level, I have Randy Weingartner going to fucking Ukraine for reasons that I don't understand. Even if it wasn't a problematic situation, technically it's not a war we're in. And why the blue hell would you be sending the leader of a teachers union to Ukraine?
Yeah.
Then that just tells me that, that the professional unions really are captured. Maybe not, and people will tell me not at the local level. I'm like, okay, maybe not at the local level, but you have to nationally coordinate. And if your national coordinating's that messed up and you don't have an alternate form of coordination, well, what do you got?
Yeah. I mean, at the local level, unions can just as well be conservative and Republican as
mine are
something radical.
No, but here it is. I say that we're actually what our union ends up being is basically Democrats, but because the political spectrum in Utah is basically totally blue but moderate blue and SLC, and then in the surrounding state, totally red.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an internal battle in the state. We mostly become kind of Democrat Republicans. Like they're the Romney faction of the Republicans. But I will also say there's a lot of times here where the teachers union is on the same side as the police union against like the Teamsters and shit on local endorsements.
Here the teachers unions will just sometimes just collaborate with like the school board on some stupid bullshit.
Well, yeah, I'm not even talking about that. Like our teachers union is basically, honestly, there have been times where the school board's like non-union interest panel gets more done than we do.
Well, nothing gets done here where speaking of organizing, I mean, I'm not good as a leader or as an organizer. This is like the one thing I felt I could do. I could make a website. I could make a website to try to spread this kind of like self-education.
Whereas, like I am a pretty decent organizer. Although, really, I'm an educator, just like you. My goal and gift has always been to take complicated ideas, put them in dialogue with someone else, and through the dialogue show, hey, this is learnable. Hey, you just learned it. Why don't you go do something with it? I also know, however, given the leftist infotainment sphere, that means that I'm going to always be a functional and mid-tier podcast because people will respect me, but I'm not fun.
I have fun.
yeah. You have fun, and I have fun, and listeners probably have fun. But if you're inclined to listen to Jacobin because you think we're gonna, like, I don't know, change the Democrats in 2 years,
I'll say this: you're a lot more fun to listen to than Jacobin, who basically hit the same note every time.
Well, this is what I worry about with them, is that the actual magazine and the website's actually fairly diverse in the views it prints. But it does seem like they were hitting a wall of steam. Like Ben Burgess is a personal friend. I'm not saying this to pump this up, and I actually respect the man's loyalty. All right, because as he's gone up, he has not screwed people who he knew earlier on, and I know people don't realize this. Leftist media can be vicious, and he's not. All that said, I had to say something when he was like Bernie 2024 because I'm like, are you really that out of steam? Are we really that out of steam? Because I remember thinking that.
I think the answer to that is yes.
Yes, I mean, like I remember because in 2020 it was like, well, if not Bernie 2024, AOC. I mean, if not Bernie 2020, AOC 2024 or 2026, and I'm like, I mean, or 2028, and I'm like, what? AOC polls lower than like Kamala Harris. Like, basically, only people who think like the center of the DSA like her.
Yeah, I thought for a while after the abortion Supreme Court case, that maybe like the center would like her more because of her talk on that issues. But I'm not sure if that moment's passed.
No, it seems like the center doesn't like her, but the left is getting frustrated with her for legitimate reasons. Actually, I don't even think, I don't even think it's unfair. Some of the criticisms I see on Twitter are wrong, but they're overstated. And even I've stated stuff that I've discovered later on that people on left-wing Twitter got from right-wing Twitter and didn't realize it. Like the whole, she was a millionaire, and I actually looked up her assets, and I'm like, oh no. She's much better off, and she's dating a millionaire, but she's not a millionaire. She's like just an upper middle class person now.
Yeah.
So
also pays rent in New York still.
Yeah, I mean, so like, she's not that compared to our other legislatures. She's still not that far removed from us, even if she's got a parasocial reach that's kind of absurd. That said, it shows the problem of the post-Trump model of local people with big national profiles, but actually can't do much because the national profile doesn't affect their local politics that much. That's also true on the right. I mean, you see that that model is actually kind of built by the right. Like, find an attractive woman, Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is going to take extreme positions, use her to bait liberals, have liberals take the bait, and also, without realizing it, prove how fucking sexist they can be, etc. Use that against them, and then have those people, even though they're not effective and not particularly popular, stay around because, well, you got to own the libs and you don't have any other thing to do it with. I kind of think, people don't want to think about the squad as that. I don't think that's the substance of their politics entirely, but that's kind of what they ended up being.
I mean, we'll have to see if any of the local. I mean, it's positive development. I mean, there are so many local people now.
Yeah, there's 120 local DSA candidates, right? Like
something like that.
But a lot of them have had some serious problems. So
yeah, but I mean, this is like if we're comparing this to like the Tea Party, that eventually did yield something. Like
it did, but it actually so. I think the comparison to the Tea Party should worry you.
Yeah.
Because what the Tea Party did was build the grounds for Trumpism in a lot of ways, but also by the time it was becoming popular, it was no longer substantively different from the Republican Party's base.
Yeah, I think that like what people have to keep in I responded to some like conservatives tweet who was making the exact same critique that the left does that of like the Democrats, that they're not Machiavellian enough, that they don't stick to their guns enough and that kind of stuff, but making about the Republicans and conservatives.
Well, they do sound just like us a lot of the time.
Yes, they do. It's the exact same thing because people don't understand that when we're talking about the state, when we're talking about those central political parties, it's not about ideology.
Bingo. Perfect. And actually would even go further than that. I was actually reading a Pew poll for this thing that's going to come out before we release this, but after we're talking today. So it's going to come out on the 16th. This is the 15th of October, just so I can date it. I know that means that people who hear this will be like, this was recorded a month ago. Shut up. There's a long lag between when I record and when I release on the free podcast. Sorry about that. No problem. That's easy to take out. I can even edit it out of the video. All right, into 129. Okay. What was I saying? 130.
It's not about ideology.
Oh yeah, it's not about ideology. According to this Pew poll, every major ideological faction in the United States thinks it is losing.
Yeah, because they are.
Right. It's just like everybody who anybody believes in thinks they're losing.
Because it's not about what people believe. Like, people don't understand that the state has how it does things, why it does things. There's an institutional logic to it that they've developed these mechanisms over 100 years to control society, to make sure it doesn't get out of control. And
they've gotten pretty good at it. It's kind of breaking down a little bit, but it's not breaking down as fast as people think.
And crisis is how it adapts. Either it adapts or it dies and it's replaced by something else. That is the rule of evolution when we're talking about both societies and organisms. And the state, the bourgeois state, has adapted so far. And it's only going to change. It's only going to do things differently as a response to a crisis.
Right. And I think this is where you and I are somewhat similar in that one of the things that does worry me, though, is while it's been adapting for its own power, if you look at the way these powers now interact with each other, they've lost the ability to have finesse that they had in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And so I really do think the fight for workers to understand themselves so we can start building up a different politics is almost existential. and it puts us. And I mentioned this in another show that I recorded recently. That it puts us in a paradox where, on one hand, I have to admit we need the strategy of patience. We don't just need the strategy of patience on party building. We need the strategy of patience on rebuilding and reconceptualizing most of the things we do. And at the same time, we are totally running out of time. We are totally running out of time. But the longer that we put off or try to shortcut it, the worse the situation gets and the less time we have. Yeah. And when I have pointed that out to people, I people will say, well, Varn, you're being vague. You don't give us the answers. Someone like Jimmy Dore gives me the answers. And I'm like, what? To do what exactly? You're not going to win a third party electoral candidate because you haven't done the stuff to win it. And like the People's Party is like 100,000 people in a Slack. It's probably not 100,000 people. It's probably more like 5,000 people in a Slack. But I mean, like, that's what it is. That's not an answer, even if it seems like one. The answer is harder because it's slow and you have to build all the work and we have to understand the terrain, and we don't understand the terrain. Fuck, we don't even agree on what we're talking about most of the time, to go back to your point about the stats and like definitions of class. I mean, Baristagate is stupid, but it's also an indication of how lost people are about what class is. Because, I mean, there is a way, like, as people who don't know, Baristagate ends up arguing that the workers at a small business coffee shop are not proletariat, but the petty bourgeois who own them are, and they can selectively quote Kautsky, Marx, and Lenin which out of context to build this argument. It's out of context and it's wrong, but still
insane thing. It is literally it is the most perfect perversion of like everything, because it is done precisely to defend one thing, and it's the capitalist class. Right. It is so perverse and obscene. I can't even believe it once I realized what it was doing.
Yep, which is why those people are now getting, it's why weird organizations that engage in that all of a sudden, after 30 years of stagnation, have a bunch of money.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Not organic, my friends. But anyway, that's enough shots fired. So we've been all over the place, but you and I always do that when we talk. But to bring it back to, and I mentioned this throughout, and I think this is a through line, all the stuff we're mentioning is why getting a self-understanding and a way to correlate these statistics and get kind of workers' inquiry. But also, one of the problems with workers' inquiry historically is that it's totally qualitative. Like, and while that's useful and it's important, and like Apparismo in the 60s and 70s did a lot with that, for example, in Italy. But if we also can combine that with good qualitative research that isn't totally dependent on the Federal Reserve or the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Wall Street fucking Journal, then we might be better able to start figuring out what we need to do, where the fracture points are, and how to reach these people without trying to pretend that we have a preformed ideology for them, because that's not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. It needs, like, for so many reasons, because it's about the here and now. It's because people, in order, like the whole thing has to be about seizing on the next crisis in order to change things. And it has to be, people need to understand what's happening when that happens, because otherwise the bourgeois state will win by default, or will just be general chaos.
Yeah, it's either general. It's like an incumbency. If you don't have a good counter campaign, it's either going to collapse or it's going to stay in power. But there's not a whole lot of other options unless you have a counterpower for it.
And if we don't have like this popular understanding and self-pedagogy, like we will repeat many of the mistakes of like of 20th century actually existing socialism.
Yeah, fuck. I don't even think to me, I've seen us repeat the 70s going into the 90s, going back through the 70s, and somehow I think we're going to come back on the 90s again. Like, that's where I think we're at. Like,
that wouldn't be nice.
Like,
I mean, like, to be in the 90s without having like the fall of any actually existing socialism would just be depressing. It would be like How could you have a farce of the 90s? That's insane.
Yeah, you have the 90s, but you're poorer. There's no hope. And there's no counterpower. And there's no false socialism. It's just like
And TV
so.
sucks more.
Yeah. That's also objectively true. And TV in the 90s is overrated. But I mean, I kind of feel like I've made the argument that the aughts have felt like the long 70s for like 15 years, since 2007. And we had the 80s for 2 years, which is the middle of the Trump administration. And we're back in the 70s. And then I realized, well, maybe I need to build beyond decade metaphors. Yeah. But I actually do think it's important to frame it like that a little bit, because I do think the crisis that we're dealing with now is still the crisis of the 70s.
It is. I mean, it's funny that you say that, because I brought this up before. If you look at profitability, like the 70s is when it hit the head. Is that there was the crisis of profitability. Suddenly, the capitalist class was experiencing such a the real income being created via surplus was so small, it endangered the reproduction of the capitalist class.
Yep.
And then after that, it's this profit rates have never fully recovered. We're still in the mid 60s.
Yeah, we never gotten past 1968 in the beginning of the downturn.
Yeah.
Which is so weird, because when you think about how people freaked out in the 60s about the drop from 10% to 2% profitability, it's kind of amazing when you're like, we have never seen that prosperity since then.
Yeah.
Ever at all.
It's we are still in that, in some ways, in that profitability crisis, but we've developed the defense mechanisms that developed out of that are still changing.
So we have profits at all. I
mean,
right?
It's weird because we don't have the profitability rates haven't changed that much, but the real income going to the capitalist class, I mean, part of that is that so many parts of income are now going through profits and stuff. Now you need to be self-employed or have this business to be making money that you would have had as a worker, doing the same things you would as a worker in the 60s or whatever. But we are still confronting the same fundamental problem and developing new defense mechanisms against it, or the state is. And the biggest problem, the biggest contradiction that's come out of that is this reemergence, or in the US's case, the first, this emergence of the political petty bourgeois in the US that has become so all-encompassing. It is it's like fascism without the Bonapartism that made fascism a big historical thing.
Well, I think it does have elements of the Bonapartism, but what I would say it really lacks is a mass base beyond that. Even though we have a ton of lumpenized workers and stuff who are attracted to this, and sympathetic from all of these classes that have been kind of hit.
Well,
none of them have been mass.
Well, our lumpens are of a lower class than they used to be, because you could get lumpens to beat people up. Now they just yell at people on the internet.
Right. I mean, and I do think media has fundamentally changed a lot of this, but it's one of the reasons why I always called the Trump phenomenon and what now post-fascist, is because I'm not sure the fascist analogy is helpful, but I am sure that there are ways in which this rhymes and that are real and substantive.
Hitler particles are real. They are inside of us as we speak.
And
honestly, I think it's a brilliant metaphor, because of what the petty bourgeois political impact is, because it's not like there is no going to be Trump dictatorship or whatever, but there is this themes of fascism in petty bourgeois
Hypernationalism at
politics.
yes, there is the want for the state to settle the profitability crisis, the want for the state to prop up old modes of production that it can't really do. I mean, it has the same problem that all fascism does, which is that it's fundamentally incoherent and probably can't last. But we shouldn't rest our laurels on that, because last time we did rest our laurels on that, it killed, a large portion of the European population, and like half the Jews, and some, and a bunch of other groups, Slavs. Like, it could, like, this kind of scenario can be very, very bad and still not be sustainable. And I think some people think, well, the insustainability of it will save you. And I think I even used to be one of them, because I used to be like, well, there's no, like, right-wing neo-Keynesian MMT whatever isn't gonna work. Its class basis isn't coherent. It's like, and I'm like, now I'm sort of thinking, no, it isn't gonna work, but it can fuck a lot of shit up.
Well, here's the thing: is that it's not going to work in Europe, even as like a temporary thing. We're seeing that with Liz Truss. That
or
it could work in the U.S. for a few years.
Yes, it could. And I will say right now, outside of China, it is kind of the dominant political form.
Yeah.
Like, I told someone recently, I was like, well, what do you think about denazification? I'm like, look, right now, in the current scenario we're in, who other outside of China isn't full of fucking Nazis? Like you're gonna tell me Modi's India is not full of something that explicitly pulls from a fascist movement and talks about its Semitic problem? It just means Muslims and not Jews. Are you gonna tell me that Zionism isn't getting real weird these days? Are you gonna tell me that there isn't something to, like, as these Islamist states move away from Islamic law, that they start looking a lot more like, ironically, considering everybody called the Islamicists Islamofascist? I'm like, well, yeah, but the people who move away from Islamic law look actually pretty kind of fashy, frankly. It's the dominant emergent form, like, everywhere. And the left, I mean, we would talk about this globally. As of October, it looks like the nascent new pink rave just crashed on a beach of Federal Reserve banks, not really understanding its own electorate, and leftists huffing their own fumes again. Like, because the Chilean constitutional reform, botched. Lula is not doing as well as anyone predicted. Even if he wins, he's going to have a much more right-wing government than was predicted. And as of right now, it's not clear that he's going to win. Bolsonaro is doing way better than anyone thought. I mean, it's bad times, man. Anyway, closing argument. Why is Casper important? Since we've just been doomers for an hour of this 2-hour show. And what are we going to do? What are you planning on using it for? This is what we're going to finish off here today. What is this for, other than, the immediate gathering of data and collating there? Why? It's
not just data. It's also like getting people to think about, like, interestingly enough, people have been far more interested in discussing those future things of, like, how would planning work? How would the accounting systems work, and all that kind of stuff?
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. Everybody wants to have that's the sexy part of socialism. I get it.
So there's lots of that. I think the important part, though, is trying to get people interested and to think about how they can create knowledge of, like, the material economic realities around them on their own, or in collaboration with peers around the world, outside of the state ideological apparatus.
Yep.
Because this whole project is getting outside of that, getting, like, this, which has dominated in socialist states in the 20th century, in every state, where it became like this matter of expertise, and but wasn't like separate. And because of that, because it was so integrated into the state, it became so much of a thing of justifying like the ruling class, the ruling ideology, which is like I want to separate economics, political economy as a science from all that, so that like one as like an emancipatory thing, but also just as a way of creating knowledge better. Because I think that the existing way that we're creating economic knowledge and all social science knowledge is so terrible. And it needs to be done on a level where it is open to everyone, and where people are encouraged to learn and do these things themselves and not be worried or orthodoxy and that kind of stuff.
I'm totally in agreement with you on that. And that's like, people think that I'm like a hardcore anti-statist, and I am, and I'm not. Like, but I have been like, the vision of what we wanted to do has been limited by the bourgeois state in particular.
Yeah.
And we have not dealt with the fact that has really constrained us. And I realize what we're trying to put on offer sounds scary to people, but frankly, the status quo looks scarier and scarier. I mean, the fact that we seem to be sauntering into even flirting with the possibility of nuclear war.
Yeah.
Like, that's wild to me. The fact that, like, now that we've even got the conservatives to admit that climate change is the problem, they just don't think we can do anything about it. Like, it's and by the way, I mean, you want to talk about the expulsion of like surplus populations, right? When we say surplus populations, that's not something that naturally exists in a capitalist order. We have the capacity to help and feed all these people. It is not like in a pre-capitalist order where there really are agricultural limits and whatever. Yet, you know, I see policy now just letting a lot of people die, like both within the core countries, but oh my God, outside of them. Like Pakistan not getting that much aid is like the first hint of where a lot of this seems to be going.
No, the first hint was what happened with COVID.
Well, that too. That's true.
But
that's true.
Yeah, they're going to throw so many people under the bus, and even as people living in core countries, we're not safe.
No, we've seen our like core country life expectancies are dropping, guys. That means that they're willing to sacrifice us too.
That's you listening right now.
And I see I see it in my parents. My parents are dying younger than their grandparents. Like, I see it in the Rust Belt and in the Southern working class, which is like lost its ability to socially reproduce and is plagued with semi-lumpen problems like alcoholism and drug abuse, and they're dying younger and younger, and suicide's endemic amongst it's endemic of amongst most generations that are not middle-aged. So both the young and the upper middle-aged are now dying of suicide at higher rates. Like, they're willing to get rid of you too. I mean, like, it's, as I always used to say, whatever, I used to say this to people when they didn't get why I cared about anti-racism. And I'm like, look, even from the skin in your game perspective, okay, let's throw all that liberal guilt shit out of the way. If you're a working class person, what happens to black people will eventually happen to you. I mean, particularly what happens to poor black people, right? So poor black people who needed mental help have been incarcerated forever. Well, now that's everybody. Poor black people and indigenous people who had run-ins with the cops got shot a lot. Well, now it's everybody who has mental health problems, regardless of race, that, you know, you are likely to be shot by the cops. Like, it's not incredibly high, but it's high. That's the number one group who face violent reprisals from the cops and the most likely to die in them. And And I'm now saying, what's happening to the proletariat in the middle income world? You know, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Well, you're now seeing it come to the lower income part of the core, the pigs, the Rust Belt, the South. Do you think it isn't coming for you too? You goddamn moron.
Yeah.
Like, and the one thing I'm afraid of, I was talking to Brad Wydra today of what is he called? Touring News. And we were talking about he's afraid of the relative decline problem in the United States is going to lead to a resurgence of American exceptionalism, because he sees that like we're going to decline pretty precipitously, but because we're the safe investment for the world, it's not going to look as obvious, and it's not going to look as severe, and it's going to make us look like we were successful when we kind of weren't. And that's going to buy us a little while longer of people believing in policy suggestions and stuff that are actually detrimental, because it looks like we bought more time.
The last thing that's going to go is going to be the dollar.
Yep.
And that's what's going. Everything, it's going to soften the blow, but it's also going to mean that like it limits the possibilities of what they can do with like materially.
Yeah, I've made this point several times recently. It doesn't matter how progressive your monetary and social policy is if the fiscal policy can undercut it. And if the United States isn't proof of that, Europe sure as hell should be. So good luck. And we can either face that together and build stuff together, or we can face it alone and get trampled. That's really kind of your options. And the other thing I'm going to say, and this is my last thing, I think what you're doing is important, because we also need a left counter-systemic force, because right now, because of things that I don't think were irrational, I am not one of these people who has this partisan finger-wagging thing, even though I predicted it was a possibility, that we would accidentally see counter-systemic force to the right because of Popular Front organization. And I think that's happened. And I think that's bad, because while I'm predicting the center is going to hold for a while, when it breaks, if conditions are the same, now, I also have talked recently about the revenge of Nassam Talib, and like the fact that not only are we having black swans, it feels like white swans are extinct. It's all black swans now. But whatever. My point about that is that it's going to be, we have assumed because of that the center can't hold. The center will eventually break, but it can last. Like, I'm literally telling people, like, you're really only seeing the full dismantling of the British Empire now. Brexit is it. Like,
I think that the counter-systemic force is so important, because if you don't have some kind of institutional thing, some kind of thing that isn't just like, it has to be there. It has to be like everybody like wants to be a part of like the ruling ideology of getting into the Democrats, getting into like making everyone think in MMT, getting into the state apparatus. And look, I've been wrestling with this problem. Is like the center of my like research project of like, what is it? Is there like, is the bourgeois state going to adapt to this, or is socialism inevitable because it's not going to, and we need to have something there to replace it?
Well, I have always been, there are other options than socialism of the current. There's all sorts of fun barbarisms we could discover, including some that have never existed yet. So I mean, that's but because I've struggled with this too, because part of me has been like, since I became attracted to socialism, God, now 15 years ago or more. It's 2005, so 17 years ago. I have been toying with the idea that maybe we have been in a long delayed developmental period, right? But now I'm like that thinking is too teleologically rigid. And ironically, for everybody who thinks that this is a Grossman thing, Grossman is actually the first thing that gets me out of it. Grossman like points out, just because you get breakdown and even capitalist collapse doesn't mean you get socialism.
Right.
That actually does require you to build it.
Yeah, you have to do something. If you don't have like the institutions and the people there, it's not going to happen. And even as I'm thinking about it, even if we're talking about the bourgeois state adapting, it still needs to have that critique waiting in the wings of, like, I think that cybernetic planning is the future, regardless of whether
Me too,
socialists win
but
or
it could
not.
be capitalist cybernetic planning.
Yeah, and you want that, and we want that to be a thing. It is a necessary thing, I think, for the survival of civilization. And like, you want to be on that. We want that to be a thing, because the alternative of it not being a thing, of us not, of that, of our societies not adapting to have that be a part of it, is very bad. And like the old, like, regardless of what we think is going to happen, we want to be putting forward these institutions of things that we think are necessary for development, things that we think are necessary for like the survival of the human race, and like, we cannot rely, it can't just be a thing within like the state apparatus today, because it has to exist outside of it, and whether it adapts to incorporate it or not, that's whatever. It has it has to be able to not rely on that incorporation.
Right. Counter-systemic means it is a formalization of the idea of dual power. Like, you have a system, you have built it up, it is outside the state. And honestly, conservatives have understood this in many ways better than we have, because they did build a para. They built a bunch of para institutions and used it to make, in the United States, the movement conservative the dominant political thing, that even if you were not a movement conservative, you were responding to them because they had a counter-systemic force. That, interestingly, kind of fizzled out in the George Bush problems of actually having power for a while. Means it's hard to claim a counter-systemic force when you're in power. Trump has tried to. It's not really working. But we don't have that. We do not have a counter-systemic force. And the DSA, God bless it, I know you're more optimistic about parts of it than me. And I also we have to wait and see on these local candidates. But as of right now, I do not think it is a counter-systemic force yet.
You know, one of the big problems with this, and why, like, the DSA, it's so many socialists, they can't handle it, like, the counter-systemicness, because it deals with, like, I wrote about this in like an unpublished essay you read about Marxist writings on France.
It's actually an essay I really like. So
yeah?
Just so you know,
yeah, I like it too. But,
so I hope you publish it one day, because I like it more than some of your other writing, and I tend to like your writing. So,
well, one of the things I said in that was like how the lumpen proletariat was a class defined by its existence outside of the formal state.
Right. Clyde Burrow makes that point and actually tries to call them like a social category, not a class, because of that.
Yeah. And they are necessary as a part of like this counter-systemic force. Marx is technically a part of the lumen proletariat. He in terms of income, in terms of where he stands in society, he is like an intellectual in the same way that like the Decembrists, the Bonapartists, the people writing polemics for Bonaparte are, except on the other side.
Right. And that's actually historically been the core of. I mean,
but
the
my point
critique
is
of
that
socialism
this is
being a bunch of
distasteful.
fail sons. Yeah, it is distasteful.
And people
Right.
don't like. That's why the DSA and so many socialists don't like it. They don't want to deal with the messiness of counter-systemicness and the messiness of the lumen proletariat as something outside of the state and its niceties.
Well, it's also, I mean, there's also reasons why they don't like it, because you have to deal with the ugly, like, one of the things that I've been trying to talk about with the working class life thing is quit letting people like J.D. Vance be the only one talk about the ugliness of lumpenization of the working class in America, by pretending that every worker is like in an ideal situation and they're not drug addled and it's all fine. Like, because that's a fucking lie. Like, I'm not saying also that every worker is, most are not, but like deaths of despair hit the working class of all races pretty hard, and there's a reason why. And that does come with lumpenization after deindustrialization. And what is interesting about deindustrialization in America is it's not true deindustrialization, it's deindustrialization of the worker. It's not deindustrialization of society. And that's what people miss. Like, but anyway, it's been 2 hours, so people should go. Where can they find Casper?
It's Casper, CASPER forum.org.
All right. And where can they find your writing?
Palladium Cosmonaut. We could probably find out the links from my Twitter, Nicolas D. Villarreal 1.
All right.
Right there.
All right. Look at his Twitter. His Twitter is useful. Nico and I started as frenemies and we become friends. We still going to fight on Althusser a lot, although I've now come to the conclusion that it's just a different framework for talking about a lot of the same things. And I also think Gramscian humanism's dumb. So, like, it's actually like, we don't agree on Althusser, but we both think Gramsci's dumb. No,
I wouldn't say dumb, just wrong.
No, yeah, dumb for me would actually, I would say, when I say dumb, I'm probably being a jerk, but what I mean is maladaptive. Actually, I don't mean, most of the people who we deal with are incredibly smart, and that includes all the theorists that I hate.
Yeah,
that includes a lot of the bourgeoisie.
But yes,
yes. There are dumb theorists that I hate, but sometimes it's actually more dangerous to be smart and wrong, like say Foucault, than it is to be dumb and wrong.
Yeah,
because that's obvious. So yeah, check out your work. You will be back on the show. Like, there's a little coterie of people that we all kind of have a secret Twitter group that shows up on each other's shows, and Nico is foremost among them. So you will see him again, hopefully, unless something happens. Nothing happened to Nico. No one hurt him.
Please.
Yeah, he's a nice guy. All right. I'm not declaring anything against him. Anyway, have a good day.